This is amazing. Thank you everyone for being here. What a new venue, and the purpose of the venue was that more of our fundraising went to scholarship rather than to the venue. To the Lions Center people, thank you very much, and to the decorating team, thank you very much. And I have the honor of thanking Lynn Hardy, where are you, Lynn? And Rotary Club for sponsoring our students this year. Lynn has 8 students sitting at the table over there. Stand up, gals. They're all gals. They're not usually all gals. And thank you very much for coming. And we do hope that these 8, and where are the rest of you sitting? You're not sitting at your table, but thank you for coming. Do remember that we might be sponsoring you for your scholarship next year. So thank you very much for coming. And Lynn this is the 3rd year in a row Lynn has sponsored our students. Thank you. And Rotary Club, thank you also. You've been sponsoring us for many years. Thank you so much. And you know, I forgot to introduce myself and my colleagues. My colleague Elizabeth Walker and I, Monica Sheridan, are co-presidents, and we have here a representative from our provincial, and I'm going to let Elizabeth introduce her.
I have the joy of thank you for a lovely lunch, and also to the Lions Club for their unbelievably warm welcome and help put on this event. A special welcome for Pat Joyce, who is our regional director from CFUW National.
I'd like to bring greetings from CFUW National and from CFUW Ontario Council, and I would like to congratulate CFUW Northumberland for this amazing event and you for supporting it. So thank you.
And I'm the Vice President of the CFUW Northumberland. I'm also the Luncheon Chair for this year. I want to thank all of you for coming. It's a wonderful event. And I want to let you know that thanks to your participation here, and thanks to Sheila, we are going to net over $10,000. Go for it. A few brief housekeeping matters now. Many of you received your tax receipts already, but for those of you who didn't, our treasurer, Lynn Patry, will be available following the event just by the door, and she can look after you. She's got a lot of receipts in hand, and she can also write ones for those who need them. If you're looking for a souvenir of today's event, we've got beautiful flowers on every table. Flowers in little pink baskets or pots that were donated to us by Pine Ridge Nursery. And you can purchase those, well, you can donate a minimum of $5 and take those with you at the end of the day. So there'll be people at the door to look after that as well. And please do not include the center rings with that. Those were lent to us by the Northumberland Hills Hospital Foundation. I thank them too. We do have a door prize. We have a beautiful basket of Godiva chocolates that were donated to us by member Jeanette Johnston. And I'm going to ask Ms. Fraser to help me out. I wondered if you could tell me what your birthday is. Whoever has the same birthday, whoever comes forward first with the same birth date as Ms. Fraser will win the prize. So the date is September 16th. thing to mention. There will be an opportunity to ask questions after Ms. Fraser spoke to us. And we set up a mic over there in that corner. I'd ask people to come and line up to ask questions. I'll be there to help you with the turning on and off of the mic. It's just a little button you push, but sometimes a little tricky. But we welcome questions afterwards. At this point, I'm going to turn you over to Ruth Kerr, our program chair, to introduce Ms. Fraser.
Hello everyone. This day has finally arrived. A year ago, our program committee met to discuss our desire for a high-profile speaker for our 2014 scholarship fundraising luncheon. And a remark was made. Wouldn't it be something to have Sheila Fraser speak to us? What are the chances? A former Auditor General under 3 Prime Ministers, the Honourable Jean Chrétien, the Honourable Paul Martin, Prime Minister Stephen Harper, a Canadian known for her drive, her transparency, her character, her integrity, her courage to speak up, her genuine concern for the conditions of inequality among First Nations people. Someone sought after by many prominent boards, the Ottawa Food Bank, Bombardier, Manulife. Let's do an email. Sheila Fraser replied expediently last June. Thank you for thinking of me as a speaker for your event. I rarely give speeches now, but I'm pleased to make an exception for CFUW. I used to be a member in Quebec City, and such a good cause as education. That reply set us spinning. Members would say, what a coup. How did you make that happen? Well, we really didn't. It is indicative of Sheila Fraser's persona and her view of life. We hope, Sheila, to learn about your journey from small town in Quebec to these major positions of trust and how you maintained your ethics, the lessons you learned along the way, and what you feel we need to know. So please extend a warm welcome to Sheila Fraser.
Northumberland for inviting me to speak today. I'm very pleased to participate in this event to raise funds for scholarships. I admire the CFUW for its work in promoting education and improving the lives of women. Education certainly played a key role in my life and in my family. Now, as some of you may know, I grew up on a dairy farm in southwestern Quebec, a very small place called Dundee. In fact, I think there are more cows than people. I'm the oldest of 6, 5 girls and 1 boy. My sisters and I often laugh that women's liberation started early for us. We drove tractors, we helped with hay, and were generally expected to help out on the farm. I am very grateful to my parents for the encouragement and the guidance they gave us. And education was a clear priority. In fact, in my father's family, it was the women who continued their education, as the men were expected to stay on the land. My grandmother and aunt were nurses, and my aunt Doris, who will be 90 this year, has a doctorate in social work. So going to university was a given, which was not the norm in the farming community that we grew up in. Our mother was determined that we all get an education, especially her daughters. She wanted us to learn skills so that we could be independent. And she was successful. We all went to university. In fact, 2 of us became doctors, 1 a lawyer, and the other 3 of us, believe it or not, can't hear me? No. Okay, we all went to university. Is that better? No. We all went to university. In fact, 2 of us became doctors, 1 a lawyer, and the other 3 of us, believe it or not, became chartered accountants. Frankly, when I graduated from high school in the late 60s, there were few career choices for women. You could either be a teacher or a nurse. While they were worthy professions, my path lay elsewhere. So I left Dundee for McGill, and my plan was to study that. Then 2 events changed the course of my life. First, I found that the math courses were becoming too theoretical. And secondly, I came down with mononucleosis in my 2nd year. And while I was recovering, my family doctor suggested that I try accounting. Well, I never considered it, and I thought, well, why not? So I gave it a try. And I enrolled in the Commerce and Accounting program at McGill, where I was one of 5 women in a class of 35. With graduation came the challenge of finding a job with an accounting firm, a necessity to obtaining the title of chartered accountant. It's difficult to believe today that women make up the majority of the accounting students, but in those days many firms did not hire women. And in fact, one major firm wrote to me that they had a limit on the number of women that they would hire. I can tell you I wish I had kept that letter. But there was at least one major firm in Montreal that understood the powerful contribution that women can make. Clarkson Gordon, now Ernst & Young. Even so, I was still only one of 10 women among about 150 accountants. And I am really pleased to note that that partner that hired me so many years ago is here today, Mike McKenzie. So Mike, I thank you for giving me that first chance. In 1977, I accepted a transfer to the Quebec City office, which presented some very interesting challenges. The clientele was very different from the multinationals that I was used to in Montreal. And of course, there was the challenge of learning French. I am very grateful to the patient staff and clients who helped that young Anglophone. Now, I really only planned to stay in Quebec City for 2 years. Fortunately for me, I stayed 22, giving me the opportunity to raise a family there. In 1981, I was only the 2nd woman to become a partner in the Canadian firm. And then I had my first child, another first for an accounting partner, not only in Canada, but also in the United States and the United Kingdom. It's hard to believe, but there was no maternity leave back then for accounting partners. And I have to tell you, they weren't quite sure what to do with it. So do I have stories to tell about being a woman in those years? Of course I do. Like the dinner held for new hires at a club in Montreal. The club was for men, and women were supposed to use the service entrance. I can assure you we went in the front door. Or the clients that have a hard time believing that a woman could understand the intricacies of business administration, who thought that we were secretaries. But remembering my mother's advice, I didn't allow this to throw me off. I strove to maintain my confidence and keep my focus, choosing my battles carefully. In 1999, I was lured by then Auditor General Deshotel to work in Ottawa, where I became Deputy Auditor General of Audit Operations. And when Denis' mandate ended in 2001, I competed for and won his vacated position. And yes, I became the first woman to become Auditor General. It has now been almost 3 years since my term as Auditor General ended. So let me say a few words about my experience. It was, to say the least, interesting. I learned something new every day, and I had the great pleasure of working with a group of people who were smart, hardworking, and dedicated. It was demanding, but very rewarding. I consider myself fortunate to have held a position that contributes to improving the management of public funds. The Auditor General's role is an important part of our democratic system of government. The men and women that we elect to Parliament have an important role in that they decide how public monies, the taxes we pay, should be spent, and the kinds of programs and services that should be provided. The federal government has a budget of over $200 billion and provides a wide range of services, from national defense to the education of Aboriginal children to the protection of salmon stocks. And the Auditor General tells Parliament how well those government programs are managed and whether there are measures in place to determine if they are achieving their intended results. And armed with this information, Parliament decides if money has been well spent. As I said, it's an important role, fundamental to our democratic values. In recent years, there have been several high-profile scandals in both the private and the public sectors. And as a result, the public has been calling for more accountability and transparency. Both shareholders and taxpayers want systems in place to protect their interests. They want their institutions to undergo greater scrutiny and more vigilant oversight. And they want their leaders to adhere to sound values and ethics. And they perceive the Auditor General to be a proponent of ethical behavior and good governance in the public sector, as well they should. And because of that, being Auditor General is much more than a job. Now, were there some surprises along the way? You bet there were. I remember very well how on the morning after my first report was released, I picked up the newspaper on my front porch to find my picture staring back at me. And on my way into the office, I saw my face in all the newspaper boxes lining the sidewalks downtown. Rather unsettling for an accountant. And some of the results of the audits over the years were unsettling as well. Findings of flagrant abuse of funds and, more troubling, abuse of staff were not the audit results that I expected to report. But I emphasize that these were very few and do not reflect the quality of the public service who work for us with great integrity and commitment. In fact, my experience as Auditor General has given me a greater appreciation for and respect of our public service. Now I'm at another stage of life, retirement, well, sort of. I have joined the board of 2 public companies and a local nonprofit, the Food Bank. I continue to be involved in the accounting profession and have been honored to have been named an honorary witness to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. As some of you may know, the commission was established as part of the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, the largest class action in the history of Canada. Residential schools were established in the 1870s, with the last one closing in 1996, and there were more than 130 schools across Canada. More than 150,000 First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children attended these schools. I have to admit that growing up I knew very little about the schools and the devastating impact on the students and their families. And while we generally think of education and going to school in positive terms, the experiences of those attending the residential schools was anything but. The Commission has held 7 national events where survivors of the schools share their experiences. I attended 3 of these events and heard heartbreaking stories from many courageous former students. Stories of being forcibly removed from their families. In fact, it was illegal not to send these children to schools, and the police and the RCMP actually came and physically took them from their homes. Stories of being separated from their parents, of not being allowed to speak their language. And of some children who went to schools never to return, their families not knowing what happened to them. One of the saddest comments that I heard was that these survivors had to, and I quote, overcome their childhood. The impact of the residential schools has not been felt only by those who attended, but also by their children and grandchildren. And learning the truth of this shameful part of our history helps to explain the many social problems facing Indigenous communities across our country. I would encourage you all to learn about the residential schools and the reconciliation initiatives underway to develop a renewed relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples based on understanding and respect. Now, speaking of understanding and respect, let me say a few words about some recent events in Ottawa. Here I go, she says. Some of you may have seen commentary lately about the growing gap of respect and trust between the public service and government. Quite frankly, it's not surprising when we see public servants regularly criticized by ministers, or comments made by ministers, even the Prime Minister, regarding senior officials, be it the Chief Electoral Officer or the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, calling into question their integrity. It would appear that personal attacks are becoming the standard response to those who publicly voice an opinion different from that of government or seem to impede their agenda. I find it most regrettable that valid issues and concerns are met with personal attacks rather than thoughtful discussion and debate. It is a sign of a healthy democracy that differing views on issues can be voiced in a respectful manner. To attempt to discredit institutions such as Elections Canada or the Supreme Court serves no one well. It will only fuel a growing cynicism and ultimately undermine our democratic traditions. Now, I'm certainly not saying that all is perfect in our public service. In an organization as large as the federal government, problems are bound to arise. But, as I said earlier, I am impressed with the professionalism and dedication of the people who work for us. Canada is truly fortunate in the quality of its public service, and they deserve our respect for the work that they do for all of us. I thank you for your attention and for inviting me today, and I would be pleased to take any questions you may have. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, I was turning it on. I just want to thank you so much for coming. I was sitting there thinking, oh, you're going to talk about that, and when should I applaud? So I just want to thank you so much for those comments about our Chief Justice. And I have two questions. The first question was about Mr. Poilievre, but you've already talked about that. So I'm sure you can't say too much about that. My next one, and how can you say anything about how you feel about the passage of the third reading of the Fair Elections Act yesterday?
Well, as you know, I did make several comments about the Fair Elections Act initially before the amendments. I'm particularly troubled with the process that was used for that piece of legislation, very little consultation, a rather arrogant dismissal of any comments that were made. You know, it's very easy to just stand up and say, thank you for your comments, we'll consider them, actually do nothing, but at least be gracious about it. The bill has, you know, with the amendments that have been made, the bill has been improved, but there are still a number of issues in there. What troubled me the most was that Elections Canada, the Chief Electoral Officer, is an agent of Parliament and should be independent of government in order to ensure the credibility of the work of that office. And there were provisions in there, and still in there, that would limit his ability to speak. For example, to promote voting, which, you know, really, is there any harm in that? And as well would now require him to go to the Treasury Board, which is a cabinet of ministers, in order to hire temporary staff, which is something that actually all the officers of Parliament worked very hard during my term to get that explicitly removed from the contracting policy. So those are two provisions which I find troubling. There are others that people have mentioned, for example, the Commissioner's ability to compel testimony, which I think we saw in the latest report, hindered his investigation, and there are other ones. So, you know, hopefully over time, these things can be addressed. It's clear that this bill is going to go through Parliament and will be adopted and will become law before the summer recess. I would be very surprised if that didn't happen.
Thank you for that. And then the second part of my question I can't remember the name of the group that you belong to, but there's, and again it goes with elections, and Ray Romano, Bob Ray, I think Rick Hillier, and you, and I can't remember even, they're a very good company, having you be a huge part of this, but we're not hearing anything about it anymore. And I'm just wondering, do you still meet, and what is it that you're doing?
This was an advisory group that was set up as advisory to the Chief Electoral Officer. This is nothing unusual. I know as Auditor General, I had what I call a senior panel that would meet a couple of times a year, and we would discuss issues. There are a number of people on that group, including, for example, Preston Manning, Bob Ray, Michael Wilson. We have had one formal face-to-face meeting last year, one telephone conversation, and there will be another meeting sometime in June, I believe it is. But it really is advisory to the Chief Electoral Officer. So he has brought issues to us. We talked a little bit about the Elections Act, not a lot. The first meeting was largely a briefing on the activities of Elections Canada, some of the challenges that they face in trying to modernize the elections process. And if I could just add, that's one of the, I think, regrettable things about this elections bill, is that it didn't kind of modernize the way elections are held. Studies on online voting, for example, are starting to happen elsewhere. It would be something I think should be encouraged. And now the bill actually makes it more difficult to actually do that. So there is a bit of a summary that's posted on Elections Canada's website, but there will only be, I think, a couple of meetings a year, and it really is advisory to the Chief Electoral Officer.
But very good to know that it's an ongoing process,
Yes.
and that you're going to be part of it. Again, thank you.
I have two questions. The first one is whether or not Native communities should have veto power over major infrastructure projects on their territories. And the second one is whether there is enough transparency about Canadian banks.
Oh, good questions. Well, First Nations, I must admit I'm not a legal expert on this, but I do know that there is a duty to consult, which has been clearly upheld by courts all the way through. And if not a legal veto, they certainly do have, if you will, a moral and kind of an operational veto. I mean, they can create a lot of difficulties if the consultation isn't done properly. I would hope that any companies that are going to be doing resource development or whatever will take the time to consult deeply with First Nations, and also ensure that they participate in the wealth that is generated by these very large projects. On the question of the banks, all the major banks have to do all the public disclosures that one would expect of a public company. And of course, we have the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, which I can tell you from my limited experience at Manaway is very, very, very present in the financial institutions these days. And the kinds of rigor and assessments that they do of the banks. Beyond that, I would be surprised if there would be a lot more transparency, because they are, after all, in a competitive world. And I'm sure would resist probably the level of transparency that some would want.
May I have a follow-up question on the Native issue? You mentioned consultation. We have recently been told in one of our lecture series here by a Native that consultation in itself is wonderful, but not enough. There has to be agreement. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think I tend to agree with that. I mean, this is their land. And I don't know that we would want a mining company to come into our backyard and consult and then start to dig without some sort of formal agreement. And when you look at the poverty that exists in First Nations across this country, we really have to do something to ensure that they benefit as well from the resource extraction that is going on in First Nations land.
Thank you.
Since your retirement, you've held very responsible board positions in a couple of major corporations. One of the things that we read a lot about lately is the need to recruit more women for senior positions in corporations, especially at the board level. I wondered if you had some comments.
Well, I'm really pleased to say on one of the boards, Manulife, was over a third of the board members are female. And in fact, our most recent chair, who had to resign because of age limits, was a woman. And I really do think that women bring perhaps a different perspective to issues than the men do. There are lots of qualified women out there. There's no reason that there shouldn't be more women on boards. There's an interesting study done by a group called Catalyst, where I think, if I can remember the numbers right, it was something like 10% of all board members of the 500 largest companies in Canada were female. But what was shocking was that 40% of those companies had no women on their boards. I mean, we're talking things like retailers. I was kind of shocked, actually, when I saw that. So I know that Manulife, for example, goes through an executive search firm to identify possible candidates for board positions, and is quite clear that they want female board members. And all of the latest nominations, half of the nominations have been women. So I think it will come. As you probably know, the Ontario Securities Commission has now issued this draft, I think it's still a draft paper, recommending that public companies indicate what their policy is on this, and what the percentage of women is and what they're doing to improve that. So I can only hope that things will improve over the near future.
You alluded earlier to the Auditor General's report in terms of who it's oriented to and the changing environment. In an earlier era, there was something called ministerial responsibility, which appears to have gone by the board. They seem to point fingers at anybody else other than themselves. Does that represent a problem for the Auditor General in terms of finding the target, in the simplistic sense of the word, as to who the report should ultimately be addressed to or provide details on, in terms of who's responsible at the end of the day?
A couple of elements of response. The Auditor General audits the management of programs, does not get into policy, which is can often be the subject of the problem areas, if you will. Sometimes when you see a program that's really badly managed, it actually goes back to the policy. But the Auditor General cannot comment on policy. That is really a decision for government and politicians. So the report always goes to Parliament, and it is really up to Parliament to then hold the minister responsible to account. I agree with you that the whole question of ministerial accountability seems to have fallen by the wayside. And when you see stories coming out, as some of you may have seen this week, and there have been many others, about the Minister of Public Safety who, berated the RCMP for having banned some, I think it was semi-automatic weapon, saying he never knew, and there are emails coming out showing that he'd been briefed 3 times. I think this sort of thing should not be happening, and public servants are defenseless in this. They cannot respond publicly. They cannot defend themselves. And so they become easy targets for the minister to blame and to try to deflect the responsibility onto others. But at the end of the day, the minister is responsible for what goes on in their department. And it really is up to the job of Parliament to hold them to account. This is not a new phenomenon. It's gone on for a very long time, and it's certainly not unique to this government. It's happened in previous governments. but it really doesn't change the work of the Auditor General. And in most cases, we would not get into ministers' offices, or we really would deal at the bureaucratic level.
I want to take you back to the Fair Elections Act, not as an act, but as a symptom of something that really concerns me. And that is that we didn't appear as a country to respond to this issue. The pundits did, the newspapers did. But I think that, combined with our low attendance for voting, is a matter of serious concern. And I wonder if you could make any comments about the great solutions that need to be found and worked on to help our kids, to help our group of people take seriously a commitment to choosing governments and supporting public servants and that sort of thing.
I agree with you that it is a significant challenge going forward. We see voter participation declining everywhere in all elections. I think in most municipal elections it's way below 50%. But people, all I can say is I think people are just really busy with their lives. They're not, the Fair Elections Act doesn't touch them in their day-to-day. It's easy to ignore it. And our children, quite frankly, the only way I think to get young people out is if their parents, instill in them the importance of doing this, take them to the voting polls with them, and try to get them engaged, even around the dinner table, in the issues of the day. It's very hard to get kids out. I mean, that's the one group of the population that has the lowest turnout. Hopefully, as they get a little older, they start paying taxes. They'll start to think maybe they should be voting. But I think it really comes back to what you've been kind of taught and what your parents reflect too. And if you can get them out to vote and make a big deal of it. Voting is a big deal. It's a big responsibility. And the first time they vote should be something that is celebrated. So I think it's all the responsibility of all of us to try to encourage people to vote. I know Elections Canada tries to do its part, but it's, I think, up to all citizens. And if there was a magic solution, I'm sure we've been trying that out.
Ms. Fraser, good afternoon. I have a friend who's been very hard hit under the provisions of FATCA. This is, as you know, the American government's pretty successful attempt to get money from anything they do to get American citizen, regardless of how tenuous the connection is. Do you have any idea why our government has done so little to defend these people?
I have no idea. I mean, obviously, anyone who is a U.S. citizen, even if they have lived in Canada for years and years and years, there is a requirement that they file U.S. tax returns. And the U.S. government has made that more severe than they used to. I think in large part because they're trying to deal with anti-money laundering and so on. Now, obviously most people, are living honorable lives here, are paying far more taxes than they would be paying if they were living in the U.S. So there shouldn't be, for most of them, a financial consequence to this, except, of course, for filing the tax returns, which are extremely onerous and very time-consuming, and you probably need a professional to help you do it. I don't know. I mean, I think it's just one of these agreements between countries, and it's the U.S. kind of asserting its own legal requirements.
Well, there is, as you know, the Sir Isaac Brock Society, which has been set up in Canada to help these people. My friend's experience is that, as you said, very high legal and accounting expenses in order to qualify, because they had thought they'd filed everything that they should have done along the way, and it turned out there was one thing they hadn't filed, and they had to pay thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars.
Oh, yeah.
And she just feels that the government is not looking out for citizens of this, it's just rolling over and playing dead.
Well, I guess it's difficult to argue with the U.S. Now, I would have hoped that the U.S. on an issue that is their law. I mean, it is a legal requirement for US citizens to file tax returns, even if they don't live in the US. So it's hard for Canada to somehow argue, it would have been better if the US had put in some kind of minimum or, exemptions for certain people, to not hit so many people who really are not a danger to anybody.
It's just the US and Eritrea, I think, that does this.
Hi, good afternoon. Much has been written and reported on and politicized about our Senate, but I'd like to hear an independent woman's view of how it should be reformed, or if it should be reformed.
I'm probably not going to reflect public opinion, but I actually think the Senate does some very good work. There have been some excellent studies that have come out, and one that comes to mind is Mike Kirby and the work that he has done on health care. I think that the real problem with the Senate has been, and this is going to sound terrible, but has been the selection of the people who have been appointed here. There are a lot of very capable, outstanding Canadians who are senators, but there are also people who have been named there because they are the so-called party hacks, people who go and lobby for money, and who are far too associated with the political parties rather than with the independent thought and second sober thought that they should be giving to legislation. So I think that there should be a reform of the way that senators are chosen, perhaps through a panel process, and with recommendations being made to the Prime Minister. I don't know, there has to be a better way to select senators and to ensure that they are not so politically aligned with political parties.
Okay, I think we have one more question from the far side of the room, and then we'll begin to wrap things up. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Yes, my question had to do with the Senate as well. If there were a body of sober second thought, I thought they should be experts in their fields in mathematics, environment, agriculture, science, etc. And that they should be chosen by a different panel, as you suggested, with no affiliation to the parties at all. So that was just my question, and wanted to know what you thought, but I think you answered it.
I would just add, too, that I do not believe going to an elected Senate is a solution. If people have to vote in campaign and win popularity contests, I'm not convinced that you're going to get the best. I mean, a lot of people have to be invited to go into these positions and are not interested in running electoral campaigns. So I really think it should be kept away from the political aspect of it, and try to find a way to choose the kinds of outstanding people that are already there.
Thank you, Sheila.
Thank you. Thank you so much on behalf of CFUW. So I'm just saying on behalf of the Canadian CFUW Northumberland for giving us such an interesting and stimulating talk. It's lovely to hear the inside track of what's going on in Ottawa. We all read the newspaper and we hear it filtered through media, but to actually hear things that have happened or should happen and shouldn't happen has been very interesting, and it's given us, I'm sure, a lot of food for thought. We'll go away and start thinking about a lot of the things that we've said. I'd also like to thank you, as we mentioned before, for accepting this invitation. As you know, it's our major fundraiser, and we sold over 300 tickets, so it's been a huge, huge success. We'll be able to send more kids to girls in this area for post-secondary education. And so in light of this, CFUW would like to present you with this book and a token of thanks for coming and making this event so very, very successful. Thank you.
Say thank you to you all. I would like to wish the very best to the students for going on to do great things, and we expect very much from you. Thank you.